Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to Straight Science. Straight Science is an evening seminar series put on by UAF Northwest Campus, where everyone else is currently, unless you're on online, and Alaska UAF, University of Alaska Fairbanks, Alaska Sea Grant, which would normally be in the house, but tonight I found myself in Anchorage, so we're doing this in a very unusual fashion, kind of cattywampus, but that's okay. That's how we roll. And if you live in the Bering Strait region, you figure it out as you go, and we will have success. So with that, UAF Northwest Campus and UAF Alaska Sea Grant, we are public servants to the Bering Strait region. We serve all peoples in the Bering Strait region, which includes the homelands and waters of the Inupiaq, Yupik, and St. Lawrence Island Yupik peoples. So tonight's speaker, I'm amazed. We're trying to do this, and I have to say Admiral Ben Evans is one patient man. So tonight, you know, we've got the loss of ice, we've got increased boat traffic, we've got the Port of Nome expansion, we've got lots of things going on in the Arctic, and a lot of it has to do with industrial maritime traffic, transboundary, and every which way, northbound, southbound, and everything in between. And we know if you live in the Bering Strait region, we have lots of issues around this topic. So tonight, we have Rear Admiral Ben Evans, who was appointed director of the NOAA Office of Coast Survey in 2021 in December. So he just sort of got going in 2022, and he's already in Nome, so we're impressed with that. He is responsible. He's the #1 fellow for the NOAA Office of Coast Survey, and he is personally responsible for overseeing all the mapping and charting of all U.S. coastal waters, as well, and I'm interested in hearing more about this too, as well as representing the U.S. in international hydrographic activity, which if you're in the Bering Strait region, that may hit us closer to home than we know, but maybe we'll hear a little bit about that. And so we are grateful that Admiral Evans is in the house in Nome and interested in the Bering Strait region. And with that, sir, I'll turn it over. Welcome. We are really glad to hear you. And please take it away. We are interested to hear about what is it, the Office of Coast Survey, what they do, the history, and where you're taking us.
All right. Thank you, Gay. It's great to be here, both online, but more importantly, in person here in Nome. It's a beautiful sunny day. And I guess I should have confirmed this with Amy Holman, who's here hosting us locally. Amy, are you driving you're driving the slides?
I'm driving the slides.
Got it. Okay, great. All right, first slide. So perfect. So as Gay mentioned, we're here in Nome. I've been in my role for coming up on 1.5 years now. And it was high time to visit with our stakeholders around Alaska. So I was fortunate to be able to come up this week with a team of folks from my office, as well as our local representatives from here in Alaska. We started in Juneau at the beginning of the week. We were in Anchorage for a couple of days, and we arrived in Nome today, and unfortunately have to head out tomorrow. So it's a bit of a whirlwind, but it's really been a tremendous opportunity to hear from groups across the state about the important local issues and coastal communities, and to share updates on our surveying and charting activities. You know, while some of the concerns in Southeast Alaska may be very different from here in the Bering and in the Arctic, fundamentally safe navigation and viable coastal communities are goals shared by everyone we've spoken with. I personally spent a good deal of my career surveying Alaskan waters, but I've never made it to the Bering Sea, never made it north of the Aleutian. So as we were planning this trip, it was very important to me personally that we get out here to Nome, even though it's a challenging place to reach. I'm glad we did it, and I'm glad we had great weather to do so. The Bering Strait's always been a strategically important spot. It's getting increasingly busy, as Gay alluded to, and that carries both benefits and potential risks to the region. Particularly as this long-planned expansion of the port gets off the ground, which is very exciting. We saw that today. But also as we observe an increase in traffic through these straits, both on the U.S. side of the border, but also on the Russian side of the border. Earlier today, I was privileged to meet with representatives and members of the Nome Eskimo tribe, as well as folks from the port. I appreciate everyone who's taken the time, as well as the audience here today, to share with us their unique concerns about this region. I will say that, Gay, you asked about international work, and that's not actually in my presentation. Perhaps it should have been, but I'm happy to take questions at the end. We can talk a little bit more about that. So, frequent attendees. I don't know if anybody in the audience was here when my predecessor, Admiral Shep Smith, gave a straight science talk from this podium back in 2018. But of course, as we were preparing for this one, we went back to Admiral Smith's talk, and it was really exciting to see how much progress we've made in 5 years. So we'll be sharing some of those updates tonight. Amy, can I have the next slide? Thank you. Okay. So while she's working on that, what I'm going to talk about next is just a little bit about who we are and what we do in NOAA and Coast Survey. Believe it or not, Coast Survey is the oldest scientific agency in the federal government. Our primary mission is to provide navigation products and services that ensure safe and efficient maritime commerce. The requirement for these services is no less acute now than it was in 1807 when President Jefferson founded our agency. But how we do this is certainly changing. For most of our 216-year history, Coast Survey was focused on producing paper nautical charts for safe navigation. Now in 2023, those charts are transitioning to electronic format. And more fundamentally, we are experiencing a real explosion in the demand for the high resolution data that underlies our charts, not just to support navigation, but for all purposes that require good maps of our coastal waters. And that includes things like storm surge mitigation, fisheries habitat mapping, identification and management of marine protected areas, offshore energy development, just a few examples for which we can't do it if we don't have good maps. And that's what we do. So, but fundamentally, our mission remains unchanged. We survey the seabed of US waters, and we publish products based on that data in formats which meet requirements, ideally all in a timely fashion. Next slide. So I promise that this is the only org chart in the talk, but I did want to put Coast Survey in context with the rest of NOAA and the federal government. So the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, you see our basic org chart here. We're a bureau of the U.S. Department of Commerce. And there are 6 major line offices of NOAA. We in Coast Survey fall under the National Ocean Service. Click one there. I do also want to highlight the Office of Marine and Aviation Operations. We work closely with OMAO. They provide ships and aircraft to serve the mission of the rest of the agency. Here in the Bering Sea and the Bering Straits, you maybe most frequently interact with the NOAA ship Oscar Dyson, which is a fisheries survey vessel, and Fairweather, which is one of the hydrographic survey ships that serves our mission. You may also occasionally see NOAA aircraft mapping the shoreline. You might also wonder about the uniform we're wearing. NOAA is a large civilian agency, but we have a very small uniform component. The NOAA Commissioned Corps, of which I'm a member, is the smallest of the 8 uniformed services of the United States. We have about 330 members currently. We're trying to grow. We're employed in NOAA in those roles that require a unique mix of operational expertise, technical and scientific knowledge, and leadership ability. One of the primary roles we serve in is operating research vessels and flying aircraft in support of NOAA scientific missions, but really we serve across the agency. And in Coast Survey, about 10% of our workforce is NOAA commissioned officers. Next slide, please. So what do we do in Coast Survey? Well, as I mentioned, we're required by law to survey the sea floors and lake floors of the United States and produce nautical charts with this data. And that remains our core mission. But as I mentioned, demand for our data is increasing and expanding to include uses beyond navigation. You may hear us use the phrase, map once, use many times. And this is the guiding principle behind our ongoing transformation from an organization that's optimized to produce traditional paper charts to one that is more data focused, accelerating our ability to provide authoritative, fit for purpose products in a more timely fashion. Whether that's an electronic nautical chart for navigation or a high resolution bathymetric data set to allow a ship pilot to safely maneuver a large ship with minimum underkeel clearance, or a printable paper chart product for a recreational boater to meet their personal needs, or data to produce maps of the shape and composition of the seafloor to help fisheries scientists identify and protect critical habitat. These are just a few examples of the broad and growing range of ocean and coastal management and science requirements which we need to meet. And nowhere do we see this more acutely than in the Arctic, where the cost and complexity of mobilizing survey assets is high, marine traffic is increasing, at the same time that we're seeing increasing impacts of climate change on our coastal communities. So we have to be sure that we collect the data in a way that allows us to use it to serve as many purposes as possible. Next slide, please. Beyond our major surveys, mapping data and navigation charting products, Coast Survey provides a range of other services important to safe navigation. And I've highlighted a few of those here. On the far left of the slide, you see an example of our navigation response teams that are located throughout the lower 48 and respond when natural or human-caused disasters impact safe navigation, such as hurricanes or unexpected groundings which close a port. These are small teams with trailerable small survey vessels. That's a model that works really well in an area of the country that's served by a road system, not so well in an area of the country like Alaska that is more that does not benefit from that. And it's not just Alaska, but we see this problem also in Hawaii or islands in the Caribbean. Typhoon Merbok last fall was a good reminder that we need to find a way to provide these same rapid response services in Alaska as we currently provide in the lower 48. And so we are in the process of developing a plan for a mobile team of equipment which can operate from vessels of opportunity around the state of Alaska without the need for us to bring our own vessel. We're also looking at other technologies that will allow us to provide survey services more rapidly. Another tool in our toolbox is our network of navigation managers. And I think our navigation managers, frankly, are a superpower for NOAA's Office of Coast Survey. They provide regional support and engagement in a way that keeps us on the ground and present in communities that many of our other sister offices don't benefit from. So Lieutenant Commander Hadley Owen, who some of you know is our off-going Alaskan navigation manager, and Lieutenant Caroline Wilkinson, who's here with us tonight, is taking over for her this summer. The nav manager is your local point of contact for NOAA navigation services in Alaska. They meet frequently with local stakeholders and interagency partners to ensure that we are meeting the needs of our customers. We're also involved in advancing the technology used in our survey work. See an example of that on the moving across the screen. Currently, one example of this is our uncrewed systems. Uncrewed survey vessels are a major focus for us. This shows an example of a wind-powered sail drone vehicle. And I'll talk a little bit more about this further down in the talk. And lastly, but certainly not least, a lesser known but just as important function carried out by Coast Survey is our marine hydrodynamic model development. These are computer models that we use to forecast water levels and surface currents based on tides and meteorological conditions. This is obviously important to mariners, but also coastal communities impacted by rising sea levels and storm surge. We'll be building the output of these models into Coast Survey's next generation navigation products and services. So with that context, I'd like to talk a little bit about where we perform our work and how we work alongside other agencies. Next slide, please. So the range of federal agencies that have a role in mapping and charting our coasts can be a little dizzying. And these are just a few examples here of the agencies that we work with. So first on the list is the U.S. Department of Commerce. That's us, that's where NOAA resides. But we also have the Department of Interior, which includes many agencies, including USGS, the Geological Survey, and the Bureau of Offshore Energy Management, two of our key partners. In the Department of Homeland Security, you have the Coast Guard and FEMA. And then in the Department of Defense, we have the Army Corps of Engineers, the Navy, and the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency. And that's just a small sample of the many agencies that have a role here. Fortunately, we have a close working relationship with all of these agencies. Most recently, we've had very productive conversations with the Coast Guard on this trip, both in Juneau and Anchorage. And I understand just yesterday, there were representatives of Army Corps here in town to talk about the port expansion project, which is something we're closely monitoring. Next slide, please. So when it comes to nautical charts, Coast Guard and Army Corps are our two key partners. And so here's an overview of how we coordinate our responsibilities using the current port of Nome, not the expanded port of Nome, as an example. So first of all, the Army Corps of Engineers is in charge of dredging. And so the area outlined in magenta is the US federal channel, the project. So they have responsibility for dredging that area and providing the surveyed depths in that area to us. Coast Guard is responsible for the aids to navigation, so the range markers at the head of the harbor, as well as the beacons on the breakwaters. They provide that information to us. Our role in NOAA is to survey everything else, the shoreline, the water, and then combine all of that data into a unified nautical chart that's used by the mariner. Next slide, please. Pulling back even further, here's an overview of the waters that we're responsible for. It's the entire, all of the US waters, including the exclusive economic zone, which is over 3.5 million square nautical miles. And about a third of that, as you can see from this picture, about a third of that is in Alaska. Next slide, please. So we're part of a global initiative called Seabed 2030. Which has set the goal of mapping all the world's waters to modern standards by 2030. Now, here in the U.S., we've given ourselves a little bit of extra time for that by saying our goal is to map U.S. waters deeper than 200 meters by 2030 and shallower than 200 meters by 2040. But it's still a pretty significant task. To count as mapped, an area of seafloor must not only be mapped to 100-meter resolution, but that data must be freely available to the public. The progress has been steady but slow, and as of this year, we are 50% done. But if you can click one time, you'll see that if we zoom in to Alaska, that deficit is even greater. Only 66% remain unmapped, as shown by the red color on the screen. And drilling down even further, 76% of Arctic waters are unmapped to 100-meter resolution. So the task is clearly enormous. Even though we focus more of our mapping efforts here in Alaska than any other state, the vast area of Alaskan waters makes progress slow. So how do we prioritize when resources are limited? Well, traditionally, we've looked at a number of criteria. How old is the existing data? How changeable is the area based on its geology? So if you think about an area like Southeast Alaska that's very rocky, that probably doesn't change very rapidly unless you have an earthquake or volcanic activity. But if you think of an area like your waters here in Nome or Chesapeake Bay back east, all it takes is one good storm and things have changed dramatically. So we look at that. We look at the volume of traffic. How many ships? How big? What are they carrying? Are they carrying hazardous cargo? And all of that goes into a model and helps us prioritize where we should send our ships, where we should send our contractors. This approach works pretty well in the lower 48 and even in southern Alaska, where there's significant maritime traffic. But it really breaks down in western Alaska and the Arctic, because the coastal communities in this region will never appear on a list of top 50 US ports. But unlike Seattle or the port of LA Long Beach or even Anchorage, the communities in this region are uniquely and exclusively dependent on safe, efficient maritime transportation for their very survival, for their existence. So we've learned a lot listening to smaller, more remote and isolated communities, not just here in Alaska, but in the Pacific Islands and the Caribbean. And we're working to adapt our traditional methods of prioritization to make our surveying and charting prioritization process more equitable to better include areas such as this. So what does that look like? Next slide, please. So one approach we've used is to engage directly with the communities, including navigation interests, but also a broad range of users of seafloor mapping data to ensure that we truly are mapping once to use many times. Now, this image is from a GIS-based exercise completed in 2021 to identify the highest mapping priorities for Alaska stakeholders. A wide range of contributors worked on this, each including their high, medium, and low priority areas. And the graphic you see here is the combined result of this effort. The highest shared priorities are indicated in dark blue, which which such as the area around Nome. And this is why this prioritization, along with input from our navigation managers, is why we'll be surveying Norton Sound and the approaches to Nome over the next few years to improve safety of navigation and coastal community resilience. The prioritization process also helps guide the activities of the 10 other federal agencies that have an interest in ocean and coastal mapping. We collaborate across the federal government through an entity called the National Ocean Mapping, Exploration, and Characterization Council, or NOMEC. And I have the privilege of serving as a co-chair of that body. So for those of you who contributed to this prioritization process, thank you. We know that there can be a lot of requests for input from the federal government, each of which takes your time. We really appreciate your engagement because it helps us get this right. Next slide, please. I'd also like to spend a moment on our collaboration with the Coast Guard to improve safety of navigation in the Arctic. As I'm sure you're all aware, ongoing climate change and the resulting retreat of ice in the Arctic is leading to increased traffic in the waters of northern Alaska. As I mentioned, this brings both opportunities and risks to the communities in this region, including Nome. The increase in large ship traffic in the Arctic increases the risk of a grounding or a collision or a spill, which could have catastrophic impacts on the communities and the environment in this extreme, remote, and environmentally fragile region. But to help address this, the Coast Guard has conducted a Port Access Route Study, or PARS, to identify a safe route for vessels transiting the Bering Sea, Chukchi Sea, and Arctic Ocean to the Canadian border. The PARS route south of the Bering Strait was completed in 2016, and to support this in 2015, NOAA conducted the survey work for that route for the Bering Sea and the Bering Strait. And next year, we'll be beginning the process of surveying this proposed PARS route, which you can, for those of you in the room, you can see it's this narrow path leading up and around and all the way to the Canadian border. We'll be leading that survey effort, but it's a joint effort with the Coast Guard, utilizing the Coast Guard cutter Healy, utilizing our contractors and the NOAA ship Fairweather. And as I said, that'll begin next year. So modern complete bathymetry along this route will reduce the likelihood of a grounding, but also the Coast Guard's decisions to locate that route well offshore would reduce the impact to the coasts if there is some sort of accident. So this Arctic PARS route survey that we'll be leading starting next year is a good example of how we can adapt our survey priorities to focus on the requirements and requests received specifically from communities. So I've talked a lot about the need for ocean and coastal mapping and how we decide where to survey. So now I'll tell you about how we actually do some of this work. Next slide, please. So this graphic shows the primary means used to measure the depth of the ocean, starting thousands of years ago up through the present day. And starting from the left, you see lead line. And then that really is just as described, a lump of lead on the end of a rope, lowered down, take a single discrete measurement, note your position, probably by measuring the angle to fixed points on shore, move down a survey line, do it again, do it again, do it again, collecting hundreds of depths in a single survey day. Those measurements are incredibly accurate, but they're also sparse. There's not very many of them. So, and that was how hydrography was conducted from the foundations of navigation thousands of years ago up until about the 1930s. And quite honestly, we still occasionally use that technique today. But in the 30s and 40s, we saw the advent of sonar. And specifically for this application, single beam sonar, which looks directly down beneath the hull of the boat, collects a continuous line of soundings. And so no longer do you have the gaps between individual soundings on your line as you did with lead line, but we still don't know what's going on between the survey lines. So this area here is all unknown. Fast forward to the beginning of my career in the mid to late 1990s, and we had the advent of multi-beam sonar. And that's a system which collects a swath of depths, a broad swath under the hull of the vessel, continuously, and allows us to produce a full high-resolution three-dimensional model of the seafloor. And that's really been a game changer for how we conduct our work. So ideally, really nothing should be missed in that scenario. Multi-beam is what we're using on most of our survey vessels today, but what's coming in the future? What would allow us to accelerate our progress toward a complete map of the seafloor, both here in Alaska and elsewhere? Next slide, please. Well, one of those new technologies is uncrewed systems. And I mentioned this earlier. We're seeing increasing capability from uncrewed systems, and they are quickly becoming cost-effective, efficient tools for hydrography. And the development shows no sign of slowing down. So on the left, the orange vehicle you see next to the white ship is a vehicle called the Drix. That ship that you see is the NOAA ship Thomas Jefferson, which operated a Drix on a trial basis in Lake Erie last year. The Drix has the same survey systems as one of our crewed survey launches, but it can operate 24 hours a day. It never gets seasick, so it can work in higher sea states, and it uses a fraction of the fuel of one of our survey launches. Now, this same Drix this summer is being utilized on the NOAA ship Oscar Dyson. And so they've changed out the sonar systems for a fisheries sonar. And so they'll be using that vehicle to on a trial basis as part of their pollock stock assessment survey. So you may encounter that if you're out in the Bering Sea, you may encounter them. However, we've made it very clear that we want that vehicle back for our mission next year. Our contract partners are using this technology as well. Our Hydrographic Surveys division was recently awarded additional funding for FY23 and 24 to contract for additional mapping data acquired by uncrewed systems. This is going to support the expansion of survey projects around the country, including right here in Nome, starting this year, and another project in Alaska that we haven't determined yet in 2024. And this is on top of the work our contract partners have been doing with uncrewed systems in Arctic waters since, I believe, 2015. You may have seen these systems operated by firms such as Wolpert and E-Track and Terrasond here in and around Norton Sound and the Bering Sea, doing work for us. And other NOAA offices are also using uncrewed systems for mapping. And I showed this picture before, but this is the wind-powered sail drone vehicle. It's been working under contract to the NOAA Office of Ocean Exploration. And this particular vehicle was used to survey here in Norton Sound in 2021. Next slide, please. So another new exciting development is the recapitalization of the NOAA fleet. Now, after all that discussion of uncrewed systems, you might be tempted to think that we don't really need ships anymore and that we should just do everything with robots. But really, nothing could be further from the truth, particularly in remote areas like the Arctic. While we certainly think that uncrewed systems will have an increasing role in our work, ships will not be going away. We expect that we'll need a flexible mix of crewed and uncrewed survey platforms, depending on the type of mission, depending on the complexity of the survey area, depending on the amount of traffic in that area. But areas like the Arctic, certainly we expect that there'll be a heavy utilization of uncrewed systems, but we're still going to need ship support for command and control, for maintenance, for fueling, at least for the foreseeable future. So it's great news that funding and direction was received in the FY23 budget and the Inflation Reduction Act for 2 new mapping and charting vessels. And when commissioned later this decade, we expect these ships to replace the NOAA ships Rainier and Fairweather, which have operated in these waters, but they're 55 years old this year. Now, I sailed 2 tours on Rainier. I love that ship dearly, but I will say it is time after 55 years. These new ships will allow us to meet modern standards, not just for surveying, but also for habitability for our crews. They'll meet more modern environmental standards. So there'll be a significant improvement. And we expect the announcement of the contract, the award of the contract for the design and construction of these 2 new vessels, I think in early summer. Next slide, please. So another key piece of this is recovery of existing data. We don't always have to collect new data to increase mapping of our oceans. Often the data exists, it just hasn't been processed or posted for public use. So the left-hand pane shows a good example of this. NOAA has a large archive of acoustic data, which was collected originally to look for plankton and fish and other features in the water column, not specifically to look for the seafloor. But it turns out that with reprocessing, we can actually identify how deep the water is from that data. And so we're in the process of beginning to reprocess these data. If everything goes well, we could fill over 13,000 square nautical miles, which sounds like an awful lot, but if we remember that the US EEZ is 3.5 million square nautical miles, it's still it's a drop in the bucket, but every little bit counts. And when new data acquisition is required, NOAA doesn't always have to be the one to do it. So the panel on the right shows an example from Texas, where the Texas Water Development Board assessed, they looked at our holdings, and they found gaps in the area that they needed to support flood modeling and forecasting. So they contracted for a survey to fill one of those critical gaps, and then they provided the data back to us to update the charts. So this was a great example of partnership between local and federal agencies, all aligned with the goal of mapping once and using many times. Next slide. Another technology we're watching closely is satellite-derived bathymetry, or SDB. So satellite-derived bathymetry is a means of estimating the depth of shallow waters from satellite images. And without going too deeply into the science, water absorbs different colors of light at different rates. So by analyzing the wavelengths of light in satellite images of coastal waters, it's possible to estimate the depth. SDB has really great potential. It's not as accurate as a sonar survey, but it's really good at telling you where the water is deeper or where the water is shallower. Deriving the exact depths is more challenging. But in some cases, particularly in remote areas, it can be a lot quicker. We're using SDB as a reconnaissance tool to help us refine and prioritize the survey areas where we need to send our ships and our contractors. We've also experimented with applying SDB to our charts in cases where it's the best available data. For example, several years ago, we produced a provisional chart of the Yukon River with SDB. And at the time we did this, it was really laborious. It was a heavily manual process and really difficult to sustain. But the technology is evolving rapidly, so we're watching it closely. And this may be a case, honestly, where we need to think differently about our products. For instance, on the rivers of Western Alaska, is it really critical to know exactly how deep the water is? Or is it enough just to know where the deep channel is today or this season and where the shallow water is? After an event like Typhoon Merbok, quickly assessing rivers of Western Alaska to identify the deepest water route could be very valuable to quickly restore the flow of supplies to inland communities. So again, we're thinking creatively about our products and where SDB fits into our toolbox. Next slide, please. So another new source of data is all of you. Crowdsourced bathymetry, or CSB, is the collection and sharing of depth measurements from vessels using standard navigation instruments while they're engaged in routine maritime operations. It allows us to take in data from non-traditional sources and apply that data to our charts in some cases. CSB data holds significant value, especially, again, when it's the best available data in remote areas like Western Alaska. And a number of our research and commercial partners are developing and testing software to collect and process crowdsourced trackline data for navigation waterways, such as the Ninglick River. We also appreciate the work of the towing vessel Alouac from Bryce Maritime, which submitted their data via the Rose Point software. This data set's now part of the archive at the National Centers for Environmental Information, and the preliminary results of assessing it have been very promising. And this process could be applied along with satellite-derived bathymetry to improve chart products in areas of navigational significance in Alaska. Now, you might be wondering how it is that NOAA can use these data, which has not been collected to hydrographic standards. And it's true that in the past, we've had very strict standards for this. Really, the only way to get data onto our charts was for it to have been collected by one of our hydrographic survey vessels or one of our contractors. But we've fortunately been able to develop a more flexible system that allows us to assess the quality of data over a wide range of data sets, and then use that where it is the best available data. So as of right now, we're not typically applying crowdsourced bathymetry to the chart, but it still has an important role to play in filling the data gaps, as well as our goal to map the US EEZ fully by 2040. Now, looking ahead, and as illustrated in the bottom right of this slide, we are building a curated, seamless, authoritative model of bathymetry in US waters. We call that the National Bathymetric Source. We're building this out across the country, and crowdsourced bathymetry will be an important source for this new resource, along with other sources of data. The National Bathymetric Source supports nautical charting, survey planning, and is directly available to the public via our Blue Topo portal. Blue Topo will be the primary gateway for us to deliver bathymetric data to support that wide range of non-navigation uses that I described earlier, which are demanded by our goals in Coast Survey, by the National Ocean Service, and by NOAA. We see that Blue Topo portal and this data set that we're building to support it as a critical enabler to sustain economic development and resilience in our coastal communities. Again, none of which is possible without good maps. And nowhere is this more true than here in Nome and in Western Alaska, where the impacts of sea level rise, severe storms, habitat and ecosystem impacts, and other effects of climate change are becoming more severe. As I said, we're currently building out the NBS across the country. We're learning as we go and accelerating. It's a long process to ingest all of our data holdings into this single seamless data set. But our timeline to complete the build out, including Alaska, is 2025. Next slide, please. So I've talked a lot about how we do our work. Before I wrap up, I'd like to quickly share some of what we've completed since Admiral Smith's talk back in 2018, and also provide an update on where we are headed in future years. Now, this map shows the work completed in the Arctic by NOAA Ship Fairweather and our contractors since 2018, color-coded by year. You can see the key on the left, starting with green, purple, red, orange, and blue. So a lot's been done, but as we noted, this area is huge and the requirements are growing, so we have a long way to go. Next slide, please. So what are we up to this year, 2023? It's going to be a busy one. I had the opportunity to visit the NOAA Ship Fairweather in Juneau just this past Monday. They're getting ready to transit. In fact, they are currently transiting across the Gulf. They finished some work in Southeast Alaska where that little blue dot is down by Ketchikan. They're transiting across the Gulf, and they'll be working in the southern Bering Sea for a good chunk of the summer. Togiak Bay and some areas out around the Pribilof Islands. We also have contractors shown in the lighter blue color that'll be working in the approaches to Nome and other areas in the Bering Sea this summer. So for those of you here in Nome, you may encounter our colleagues from Wolpert, one of our trusted contractors, who their survey vessel is here. They're getting ready to put it. In fact, they're very anxious to put it in the water. The ice is a little bit getting in the way, but they're anxious to get to work. Next slide, please. Looking ahead, we've got exciting work lined up for 2024 as well. Obviously, our plans are subject to Congress's budget appropriations, but the president's budget request for NOAA in fiscal year 2024 includes an increase of over $4 million to meet NOAA's mission in the Arctic. If enacted, this will support a wide range of priorities in the Arctic beyond mapping and charting. And it's exciting to see the recognition of the specific needs of the Arctic reflected in the president's budget request. For surveying and charting, our priorities next year will include sending Fairweather north to begin work on that port access route study route that I mentioned earlier, up and around to the Canadian border. There'll just be one of several ships working on that. We expect that to be a multi-year effort. We also hope to return NOAA Ship Rainier to the waters of Alaska next year after several years of working in the Pacific Islands. And of course, our critical contract partners will be part of our efforts. Those plans are still in development, but our basic plan are the areas shown in red. Next slide, please. And it's important to note that Coast Survey is not the only group working in Alaska. We coordinate our efforts with other agencies through a concept called Seascape Alaska, which is a regional mapping campaign consisting of both the government and non-governmental participants with the goal of advancing our collective mapping goals. Now, ideally, we'd have dedicated funds to systematically map all of Alaska, but this regional campaign allows one place for us to advance our goals and coordinate our efforts with existing resources. And this is a good example of the type of collaboration enabled by the National Ocean Mapping, Exploration, and Characterization Council that I mentioned earlier. It encourages participants to address requirements identified in the prioritization and coordinates participants' work to help avoid duplication of effort. The Seascape Alaska group formed just 2 years ago And this year, we're excited to have several campaigns going forward under the Seascape Alaska banner. The light blue area is work being conducted by NOAA's Office of Ocean Exploration, which we partner closely with. So their vessel, the NOAA ship Okeanos Explorer, will be working along the margins of the Aleutian chain. Now, strictly speaking, that's not the Arctic, but it does have significant impact. That joint project will help us understand the subduction zone by providing bathymetry to feed directly into earthquake, tsunami, and landslide hazard assessments and situational awareness products. We're also working with the USGS. The Geological Survey has funded work on NOAA ship Fairweather, indicated by some of the light blue area, light green area just south of Kodiak, which abuts the work that Okeanos Explorer will be doing, again, ensuring that we have coordination. The orange area up in the Bering is an area where the Geological Survey and NOAA have partnered to perform topobathy LiDAR, a coastal mapping project that will assess the impacts of Typhoon Merbok from last fall. And I've also included Coast Survey's plans in this graph of the light green areas, which we discussed earlier. Next slide, please. So as hopefully you saw on the last slide, collaboration with partners is a key element in our strategy to map US waters, and particularly Alaska. There are a number of ways to be part of this, including providing crowdsourced bathymetry, as I mentioned before. But another is partnering with NOAA through the Brennan Matching Fund. This fund provides cost sharing and in-kind support for non-federal outside mapping partners. Under this program, non-federal partners can propose a mapping project, and if it's accepted, NOAA can provide up to 70% of the funds, as well as in-kind support to manage the project. Partners benefit from this opportunity by leveraging NOAA's contracting expertise, including its pool of pre-qualified technical experts in surveying and mapping, as well as data management to ensure that the mapping data are fit for purpose and are usable for a broad set of purposes. Another way you can help is by sharing existing data sets with our integrated ocean and coastal mapping program. We want to work with you to increase access to all existing ocean and coastal mapping data that you or other partners may have. And there's a link in the bottom right of the screen, which you can follow to learn more. And again, our goal is to make as much mapping data public as possible. By sharing your data, you help us increase our capacity and close the bathymetric data gap. Next slide. So that concludes my presentation this evening. I'm really proud of what we've accomplished over the last few years. I'm excited by the possibilities that we're looking at going forward, but we're not satisfied. We clearly have a long way to go to fully meet the needs for ocean mapping data and nautical charts here in the Arctic. And we continue to work on multiple fronts to improve our Arctic surveying, including new technology, building partnerships, and increasing the use of non-traditional sources of hydrographic data. This is all with the goal of producing authoritative data, products, and services which fit for purpose formats and getting it into the hands of the people who need it as quickly as possible. This work is just as, if not more important here in the Arctic than it is in Western Alaska, as it is in the higher traffic regions of the lower 48 and elsewhere. So again, I'm really thrilled to have had the opportunity to be here at Nome, share a bit about what we're working on, but also listen and learn from all of you. And I thank you for your time this evening. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions.
All right. Now, I don't know if anyone can hear me or see me, so this is going to be a bit interesting.
We can both see and hear you, Kay.
All right. All right. Well, first off, thank you very much, Admiral Evans. That was very interesting presentation, and I have a feeling, I know you're going to get some international questions, I think, because you're living right tonight, you're on the maritime
Right on the border. Yep.
Border area. So we've got questions here, but before we get into questions, this is the time to give Admiral Evans a little straight science love in the chat box. It is never easy to be a straight science speaker, and we do have a caller calling in, and so while you're thinking of your questions and writing in a little, like I say, showing Admiral Evans some Bering Strait love, the caller has priority. Callers have priority on straight science because in this region, we all do not have the capability to zoom in. So it is really difficult to be a caller on a Zoom call because you can't raise your hand or jump up and down or unmute yourself, whatever. So caller, at any time, if you have a question, we really appreciate you sticking with it. You stuck through the whole presentation, even though you could not see the slides. And let us know if you have any question. If we have been having some trouble with unmuting, so if you have a question and you are unable to get through, you can call my cell phone, if you've got a pencil, at 907-434-1149, and we can relay that. So we really appreciate having a caller. And any questions? I've got some, I know that. Plus I have a guest here in the room from Diomede who also has questions. So I don't see any stars, but again, I'm not in the room, so I cannot see any hands raised. All right, so I'm looking at Admiral
one
Evans.
hand here in the room.
Go for it. Go for that. And repeat the question, please, for all of us online.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Marina. When you say map once, how, with the mapping data, can that be used to determine, is it just depth, or is it also understanding certain geological features that could indicate mineral deposits that could then become enticing?
Right,
for
right.
operations on this part?
Right. Yeah, that's a really good question. So to repeat for the online audience, the question was, does the data we collect just tell us what the depth is, or does it can you infer from that something, and I'm interpolating a little bit here, but something about the composition of the seafloor that might entice those interested in extraction to come and exploit those resources? And the answer is, it depends. That's going to be pretty much every question you ask me tonight is going to lead with it depends, but it depends on the type of sensor we're using. So for instance, a multi-beam sonar, we collect, that produces a high resolution model of the shape of the depth and the shape of the seafloor. However, we also collect the intensity of the return. So basically how loud the sound is when it bounces off the seafloor. And that tells us something, well, with proper interpretation, it can tell you something about the composition of the seafloor. So you can imagine that a muddy seafloor, you're not going to get very much of a return back from your sonar pulse that you send down. A rocky seafloor, you're going to get a much louder return back because it reverberates more strongly, and everything kind of in between. Can you use that to identify specific deposits? I'm not a geologist. I'm tempted to ask my one geologist in the room, but I think it probably depends on the nature of what you're looking for, how different it is than the surrounding substrate. In some cases, probably yes. In some cases, probably not. Other techniques such as LiDAR, I mentioned that much of this area is going to be flown with topopathy LiDAR. You wouldn't have that type of backscatter return from LiDAR, but you might have color. So you might be able to tell, well, what is the color of something if it was a large enough feature to register in the LiDAR beam. So not sure if that answers the question. But again, it kind of depends on what you're looking for and how you collect the data.
Well, it's also like you're taking that one data that was fisheries data, and you're reinterpreting depth.
Right.
You know, you don't know how technology will change to allow data sets to be reinterpreted, right?
That's true.
I have more questions, but other people have questions.
Do we want to, are there others in the room? Please.
The Coast Pilot, will that be updated?
Yes, we were just talking about the Coast Pilot today. Oh, sorry. The
Don't
question
forget to
was,
repeat.
will the Coast Pilot be updated? So we were actually just talking about the Coast Pilot today. the Coast Pilot is actually really easy to update. And so if there are new local information that the community would like to have reflected in the Coast Pilot, it's really as easy as getting in touch with Caroline here and either requesting that update or providing a recommendation for an update. The Coast Pilot, we have a small staff that supports the Coast Pilot, and we're really dependent on input from users in the field, mariners, folks in coastal communities, to ensure that the Coast Pilot reflects conditions, navigation conditions, and also conditions in the ports.
Thank you.
Sure.
All right, well, thank you. And thanks, Anna, that you brought up a good question, because here there was a question about the sound. So if you're going to look at the bathymetry in any kind of way for that mineral extraction, I think you really need loud sound, which I'm not sure these vessels, I don't think the Coast Survey does loud sound at the level that you would need for some of the deeper minerals like oil and whatnot. And the question was, the question here was, does any of what the Coast Survey vessels do create a problem for marine mammals or any of the other marine resources people subsist on here?
Right. So that's a good follow-up to the previous question. So typically when folks with an interest in marine resource extraction, they're using sub-bottom profilers, which are creating an acoustic map of not just the surface, but deep into the seafloor. And so in most cases of marine resource extraction, that's the type of sonar you would need to be using. That is not the type of work that we do. So related to that is the question about impacts on marine mammals or other species. We go through a rigorous environmental compliance process that looks at the species that might be encountered in any area that we survey. We've actually just completed a programmatic environmental impact statement on our entire mapping program. The short answer is that for the frequencies of sonar and the intensity of the acoustic pulses that we're using, the likelihood of an adverse impact to a marine mammal is very, very, very small. Of course, it can never be non-zero. There's always a possibility, but it is vanishingly small. And that responsibility is something we take very seriously. Again, even with that very low probability, for every survey we do, we look at the species that we might encounter. There's an assessment that's done to ensure that we have taken whatever mitigating steps we can to ensure that likelihood of an adverse impact remains very small.
All right. And we had a second question, and that was from Diomede. I guess and I'm just going to relay this message, and that is the Army has had under the banner in your 4 in the beginning, you had the 4 things that main points, and one of them was safe navigation, I think it was. Mm-hmm. So that brought the question, the Army has already been out to Diomede years ago testing, sort of heat sensing cameras and other high technology to sort of get at who's in the area and looking at those kind of vessels and getting more information about what's in the area, because once you're in the strait, it's very narrow. And hopefully maybe before you leave, you can get on a Bering Air flight or a Pathfinder flight and just fly once up and around so you can get a view of that. And the question was, for advanced technology or technological research, is the Office of Coast Survey got anything, that they would provide or bring to, or why isn't there at a place like Diomede, which is right on the border? They have interest in things like a repeater, or if in an unsafe incident, how to communicate and things like that. And so we are really infrastructure poor in the Bering Strait region. You may notice that. And it's kind of an important strategic area. And we're just wondering, does the Office of Coast Survey for Safe Navigation see the Bering Strait region maybe as a place to put more advanced or test more advanced technologies? Is that going to be a thing? And is it possible to get something like a repeater to sort of enhance our ability to even do something like a Zoom and get some better communication infrastructure? Sort of a two-pronged question, I think.
So I'll take the first part of that question. The second part of that question, I'm not really, I don't think qualified to answer because I'm not a communications engineer. So I would encourage the caller to ask somebody who actually knows something about that. So with respect to I'm going to use the term surveillance, but really reconnaissance technology. It's interesting. We just had a conversation yesterday with Coast Guard Sector Anchorage about their concerns about traffic in the Bering Strait. That we are focused on mapping the seabed. And while we certainly keep our eyes open while we're operating in an area, I think the surveillance of vessels operating in an area such as near Little Diomede, that's probably more of the Coast Guard's realm of responsibility. So I wouldn't want to speak for the Coast Guard on that. We do not have a homeland security mission or a surveillance mission of that sort. Our focus again is looking at the seafloor, ensuring that we understand what's on the seafloor, what the shape of the seafloor is, and providing products that support safe navigation.
Okay, fair enough. But it's always a question out here,
Right.
as you can imagine. So my question, unless I'm stopping anybody, but I can't see the room. My question is, we see, do you know where Pevek is?
I don't.
So Pevek is kind of as you go up through the strait to the north, and then you sort of shoot a left and go northwest.
Okay.
There's Kaluchin Bay, and then you keep going, and there's a place called Pevek.
Okay.
And Pevek, and that's where we have there's a port there that's utilized by icebreakers quite a bit, and they are now powering their community with a very large nuclear
I've read about that. A
yeah,
nuclear
generator on it's just a barge, on a floating barge.
Yep.
And I guess it's doing great things. And they've been moving a lot of dirt and whatnot there's a very large bay just to the west of Pevek. And they're moving a lot of material out of there, that sort of thing. And we also see a tremendous amount of money in the Russian government going towards improving the Northern Sea route. I'm sure it's difficult to communicate right now, but is this the kinds of things that our neighbors are doing for navigation? Is that someday, when the world gets to be a friendlier place than it is right this minute, is that something that you would be reaching out to, and we would be more in cahoots and sharing information?
Yeah,
or maybe it's already occurring. Hopefully it is, but
so that's a great question, and there's a lot there.
I'm sure.
So in ordinary times, we have a relationship with the Russian Hydrographic Service. Russia is a member of the International Hydrographic Organization, which is the international body which governs surveying standards, governs nautical charting standards, seeks to encourage countries to collaborate and coordinate their efforts. Russia's been a longstanding member of the IHO. They're also a member of the Arctic Regional Hydrographic Commission, which is basically a sub-body of the IHO, which is focused on the Arctic region. United States, Canada, Norway, Denmark, Russia. Am I forgetting somebody? Iceland's an observer. There are also a number of countries which have observer status. It's been I'm sorry?
Maybe. Is it the UK?
UK is an observer.
Okay.
They actually don't have their EEZ doesn't cross the Arctic Circle. Denmark is because of Greenland. But that's actually been a very active body. And the Russians were active participants, reasonably active participants, since the breakup of the Soviet Union, really until last year, at which point the Western countries in that group really just found ourselves in a position where we couldn't engage with Russia, unfortunately, and that's solely as a result of their actions. So the result is we now have an Arctic Regional Hydrographic Commission, which is arguably missing about 2/3 of the Arctic, the Russian controlled portion of it. We certainly hope that in the future we'll be able to welcome Russia back into that, but that is completely in their control at this point.
Okay, and thanks for that. You are in a sort of a very interesting region tonight, so
It
you
is
think about these
very
things.
interesting. No,
Um,
and as well you should. Yeah, so I'll leave it there.
And one of the other things was you were talking about the gliders and things that these unmanned aerial craft and these unmanned sailing craft, and I'm sure there's unmanned underwater aircraft or not underwater aircraft, underwater
Vehicles?
drones.
Sure.
Yeah. And so since we're in the Bering Strait and this will be available to the public, do you have any specific and I think I might know the answer to this, but is when in the Bering Strait, we're not allowed to do collection of information once it crosses the line, the border.
Mhm.
So oftentimes, because everybody seems to be throwing stuff in the water these days or flying around doing things, and if they're unmanned, it can kind of get whoopsie doodle. Accidents happen, things get out of control. We're really strong currents here. We have bad weather and things like that. You'd be surprised when people find things on the beach. Do you have any, for the NOAA glider people, the sail drone people, we were saying from up here, please put American flags on your equipment or they may get destroyed by people on our side because we don't know what it is, or if it doesn't have any kind of identifier that identifies it as an American scientific thing. So we do have things that people see and pick up or take photographs of and let it keep doing their thing, both in the air, believe it or not, and underwater and equipment floating past or washed up on beaches. Do you have any specific protocol you would like people to do in this region when we have that? That may be something the Coast Guard probably wants to know about, and I have a number for that, but I didn't know since you're up at the top.
Sure.
If you had any advice on that.
So I can't speak for vehicles that may be operated by our contract partners. I can really only speak specifically for uncrewed vehicles that are operated by us in Coast Survey or by our partners in the NOAA fleet. And I will say that in all cases, they are clearly marked as to what they are, who to call if you find them, if they wash up. In fact, we've unfortunately had to invoke that on a couple of occasions over the course of our long journey of experimenting and testing these equipment. But in general, though, I will say that the vehicles that we're operating, I mentioned that we operate them in tandem with our crewed survey vessels. And so if you see one of our, like the Drix vehicle that I mentioned, if you see that out operating, it's not on its own. It's within radio range of one of our ships or one of our other craft that's monitoring its progress. So it shouldn't just be out doing its own thing, potentially going haywire. It should be part of the reason we have the ships that are operating in close proximity to them is to interdict that if in fact some malfunction occurs.
Right.
I think there are certainly other groups within NOAA, other groups within the federal government that are also operating uncrewed systems, gliders and other systems. My understanding is that in general, at least all the ones I've ever seen are clearly marked, property of US government, call this number if found, stickers, flags, whatnot, to try to make it clear that it's not dangerous, it's not a torpedo, it's not a munition. And if you find it, we'd really like it back.
But that's wonderful. And sometimes people find things that are in Asian lettering or Russian lettering, things like that. So it gets a little tricky. And regardless of the phone number on it, I think that it would probably be most appropriate to call. And hopefully this is correct. And Amy, I'm going to ask you to check this number because I'm doing this off the top of my head. But if you see something on the coast, especially these days, and it sounds like we will potentially have a lot of things in the water that we know about, and maybe some things we don't know about. And I'm sure our neighbors are doing all kinds of good science in the water as well. And that would be to call the U.S. Coast Guard RCC, the Rescue Coordination Center. They always are really good they love to hear about these kind of things. And their 1-800 number is, if anybody needs a pencil, 1-800-478-5555. And Amy, if you can confirm that, that'd be great. So that's just a shout out, because when I saw those, you know, the sail drones, and we're going to have contractors and or things like that, and their stuff's up here, and then we have all these oceanographic vessels that are coming. Some are not ours, but are allowed in from the State Department, and they're dropping stuff in our waters. And also the current brings things over from other people's waters. It can be quite something when you're talking about this. So I just wanted to put that out there because it can be busy. Any other questions? And thank you so much, Admiral Evans.
Of course, other questions here in the room? Yeah.
So what percentage of the Bering Strait in Russian waters is mapped?
I don't know.
I don't know.
What's the question?
Yep, I'm sorry. The question was, what percentage of the Bering Strait in Russian waters is mapped to modern standards? We could probably find out, or at least make an estimate of that. You know, it's interesting, and you were asking a question earlier about free and open access to data. United States is one of the few countries in the world that provides free and open access to hydrographic data, to ocean mapping data. I don't know, but I suspect that the Russians are not in that group. And so it may be difficult to know exactly what the holdings of the Russian Federation is. We can certainly make some estimates, perhaps based on the global maps of the ocean, but it may be hard to know exactly what Russia has mapped on their side of the border.
They have a pretty good coast pilot. I just have to say that in the Bering Strait region. They're hip to that. They just updated it a little while ago.
That's interesting. It'd be really, again, I would encourage listeners and folks you may be in contact with on the Coast Pilot. We often don't get a lot, in many regions, we don't get a lot of input for the Coast Pilot. And frankly, we're not sure anybody's reading it in some cases. But if that's an important resource here, please do provide input. Let us know, because we don't always know how people are utilizing that product. And again, if you have input for it, if you would like to see corrections, if those things go out of date incredibly fast, please provide that input to Caroline.
Yeah, Caroline, know that we do peak at the Coast Pilot on the eastern side, and we are a shared waterway. It's so if you have difficulty, you may find yourself, and it isn't as, we do have safe passage in the strait, so it's good to know where to go in a pinch if you're in a boat.
There was a question here in the room, which I should have answered straight off, which is, what is the Coast Pilot? So the Coast Pilot is it's a companion to the nautical chart. It's a written guide for the mariner, and it includes information. It basically includes qualitative information that you can't readily portray on a nautical chart. So specifically highlights safe harbor, places to anchor, particular landmarks that a mariner might look for. Includes directions for how to enter a harbor, a particular harbor. It will have information about what you'd find in that harbor, where to get fuel, where to get ice, where to buy groceries, what marine services are available there, where you can have your boat hauled out. So it's a pretty broad range of information that can be in the Coast Pilot. It also includes discussion of prevailing weather conditions, prevailing tides and currents. So again, it's intended as a companion for the mariner in conjunction with the nautical chart.
In Alaska, oh, I'm sorry.
I was just going to say, if in the NOAA fleet, it's required reading anytime we go someplace new.
In Alaska, it would be comparable to, Alaskans may be more familiar with the milepost for driving. Sort of, you're going down the road, you're at mile 30 and there's a place you can spend the night, like there's a couple cabins 10 miles up or something like that. So it's if you're traveling in a boat from the old days when you just be in a sailboat, the way I was raised, and you need the Coast Pilot because you need to know where to pull in and get food or ice, and you don't want to crack up and you don't want to spend all day looking for who's selling the fuel, those kind of things. So it's like a friendly guide to get you safely into a place. And sometimes you need to get in a place and you don't know at all where you are. And so it's very, very helpful. It helps locate you and helps give you what the amenities are and how to avoid trouble.
That's
Where
great
the
feedback. Yeah.
customs are, things like that.
It's great to hear that it's a valuable resource here in this area.
Well, yeah, I was raised with them, so then that was a
Yep.
good thing. And I think,
Are there other questions here in the
yeah,
room?
are there any other questions in the room? I do have a Murbach question, but I'll wait.
Yeah, absolutely.
What's the urgency behind the 2030 goal? And
Yeah.
why start with the deeper water?
So the question was, what's the urgency behind the seabed 2030 goal and why start with the deeper water? And there may be more to the urgency than I'm aware of. I was not in my current role when this was kicked off, but I will note that the UN has dedicated this as the ocean decade, the 2020 to 2030. And so a lot of initiatives in around the world are being in the ocean space are being keyed to this decade. So seabed 2030, with 2030 being the end of the ocean decade, as setting the goal to have this complete map of the oceans. I think that was part of it. It's a motivator, right? I think that there's recognition that with the increasing, not just in navigation around the world, but with increasing impacts of climate change, so much of that is tied to the ocean, because the ocean is a huge sink of heat. It's a huge sink of carbon. And if we're going to understand climate change, if we're going to understand the impacts of climate change, the changes in global circulation of water, all of those things, really, the Earth's climate is driven by the oceans. And without good maps of the ocean, we can't understand those phenomena. And as we know, the challenge of climate change is urgent and growing more so. And so I suspect it was a combination of factors that led to pegging 2030 as the goal. Why the deep stuff before the shallow stuff? The deep stuff's easier. I talked about how we use multi-beam sonar typically these days to map the seafloor. Well, that swath has a fixed width and angle. So in shallow water, it intersects a fairly narrow swath of the seafloor. As you go deeper and deeper, for every pass with the ship, you get more and more seafloor mapped. And so it turns out that mapping the deep water is a lot easier than mapping the shallow water. You also don't need to worry as much about getting up into the nooks and crannies of a coastline. You can just run long straight lines, cover large swaths of area relatively easily. So that's why 2030 for 200 meters and 2040 for the shallower water.
So then how does mapping depth relate to all the climate data?
Sure.
Heat sinking and ocean acidification and redispersal of marine life.
Sure. So these are not my areas of expertise. Oh, sorry. Question was, how does the shape and how does bathymetry really impact climate change and the behavior of the oceans, and how does it impact oceanography? And I should preface it by saying it's not my area of expertise, but my understanding is one area that I do know a little bit about is, for instance, ocean circulation models. And so much of how heat is distributed around the globe is driven by ocean currents. Ocean currents on the surface, and then as water changes temperature, it may drop down. So we have ocean currents at the surface. We have submerged ocean currents. Those circulation models and those patterns are driven by the shape of the basins of the seafloor, and they're impacted by seamounts, by submerged, by underwater mountain ranges. All of these features that we find when we map the seafloor. And so really understanding at fine scale how those currents move around the globe requires a really high resolution map of the ocean. That's just one example, but certainly if we think about marine ecosystems and where are fish and other marine species likely to occur, we need to understand their habitats. We need to understand what the seafloor looks like. What is the shape? What is the depth? What is it composed of? So that we can identify the areas where fish or other sea life are likely to occur by species. Again, that mapping data helps inform and helps us predict and understand where those ecosystems are found. So those are just a couple of examples. I could probably come up with more, but again, I'd be getting out over my depth.
Right, and I have one more.
Absolutely.
Because, so. Yes, mapping is great for safe navigation and reduce problems like oil spills, but it can also bring more ships into the area and say like, hey, there's a great like trail, and then that turns into a highway and we have more ships. And so what if some groups are like, we don't want you to map because we don't want other people to know
Right.
what's here, that we already know what's here.
Right. We haven't encountered that specifically.
Can you repeat that?
Oh, sorry, once again. The question was, and I'm paraphrasing, please correct me if I get it wrong, but what if some groups don't want the oceans mapped because they're happy, they feel that they have adequate knowledge of the seafloor in their area, and there's concern that better maps will just attract more traffic and more users? Did I capture that correctly? So that's not something we've encountered specifically. I will say that we encounter something similar when we find shipwrecks. Because oftentimes they're shipwreck hunters, we find a shipwreck and we put that data out there, and then there's concern that resource, that historic artifact will immediately be become a hotspot for divers who may or may not respect the sanctity of that location and the artifact. So we have run into it in that case. And there are, in fact, there are procedures. There are laws. We have to consult with the National Historic Preservation Act requires that we consult with the agencies that have the states or federal agencies that have responsibility for those resources to ensure that we are portraying them correctly. And so our goal is always to release the maximum amount of data as possible, because that's taxpayer funded activity. But in some specific cases, we don't. We may obscure some particular feature on the seabed if it is a particularly significant artifact and there's concern. That's related but different than the question you asked, which is more generally, do we want to update charts? If doing so will attract traffic that the local community may not want.
Admiral?
Yes.
If I could just add on to that,
Sorry,
maybe.
please.
And is that Anna? Is that you?
Yeah.
Asking?
Yes.
Okay, so know that I think I know what she's getting at, and if it helps, I think, and Admiral, you stop me here, but the Office of Coast Survey is looking at the physical feature. The physical feature. They want to see if there's a big rock, or if it's mud, or if it's sand, or what. But know that things of the physical nature versus the biological. So we are pretty shallow. Once you get up on the shelf by Saint Matthew, it just is like a flat plane all the way up to, for the most part, on our side, for the most part, all the way up as you get up into the Chukchi. But the biology is what I think he was getting at. The biology is driven by a whole host of other different things that are not, it is not a standardized just because the bottom is standardized. So if that helps you, Anna, it's there, I think, getting at the physicalness of it, which is helpful, but you have to know the currents and the biology, all the biological input that's coming in from rivers and different temperatures and things like that, if that helps. So it won't be the same, even though it may look the same
I think you answered the question, Dave.
as you
Thank
go south to north. Hope that helps.
Other questions here in the room?
I actually do. This has been so interesting to me because, but I can't see. So am I clear to go?
Go.
Okay, Murbach. So
Yeah.
will you now we've got Murbach, and Murbach kind of, we get these storms once in a while and they roll the bottom all the way, top to bottom, the whole thing. So will we see you now in when we get a port, will we have more? I mean, we don't get, anybody cares whether the bottom, what happened to the port. Is this something, in the old days, is this something we'll now see because there'll be more interest in that? Will we see more dedicated coast survey if we have another Merbach and things like that to kind of get at, what sort of the problems that can happen when you totally turn our ocean upside down in a storm like that?
I mean, it's hard to predict the future, of course.
Okay. Yeah.
But I think as we're seeing this year, part of the reason we are dedicating significant resources to surveying the north side of Norton Sound this year, as well as the topography LiDAR that's being surveyed. A lot of that, the bathymetric, the ship-based survey, I think was in the plan before Merbach. So I can't claim that
Okay.
we're being exceptionally responsive,
I was
but
like,
certainly,
wow. Yeah.
certainly Merbach created some additional urgency. After
Okay.
the port expansion, of course, Army Corps will have responsibility for surveying the channel,
Okay.
the dredge channel in and out of the port, just as they do today. And my understanding is that they're dredging and resurveying that roughly on an annual basis. I don't know if that, actually I asked the port folks today if they foresaw a change in the frequency of that with the expansion of the port, and they weren't sure.
Okay.
But I believe
Right.
it is part of the Army Corps' planning for that. They're budgeting for that.
Fair enough.
So I think that we, of course, would want to be responsive to this region in its current status, just as we are now after Merbach dedicated significant resources to resurveying. I would say that if the Port of Nome, after the expansion, and if it grows and if we see increasing commercial traffic into this port, bringing with it increasing risk, then that would only rise higher on our list of priorities. Because again, we're looking at trying to minimize risk of risk to life or equipment, risk of pollution, by ensuring that mariners have have accurate navigation data to navigate safely.
Right. And we still have a caller who's hanging in there. And caller, I know you can hear us, and I am very happy, and feel free to just blurt in anytime if you have a question or need some information. Thank you for hanging in there. My last question, honestly, is the Topo 23.
Bathy LiDAR?
So that's NOAA and USGS. And it looked like, is that actually going to be Topo? Made me think it's actually going to be it's the shoreline, or is that? Okay.
Yes.
So it's not the surf zone. It's actually the physical shore. Is that?
Yes, and
okay.
the type of LiDAR that will be flown. So this is the story on this is a little bit convoluted, and I'm looking at my colleagues in the audience to make sure I don't misspeak. But
Sorry.
after USGS received, United States Geological Survey received supplemental funding to address some of the impacts of Merbach.
Okay.
One of the things that was needed was to understand how the shape of the shoreline had changed, really from Nome well south, and so they transferred a portion of the funds that they received to NOAA, because we have a LiDAR mapping capability, both with our contractors and an in-house capability. That's well developed, and I guess USGS may not have that, or at least they don't have the bathymetric component of that. So the type of LiDAR that we'll use for that work is at a wavelength, at a frequency, which can both map the shoreline area, the dry side, as well as penetrate the water down to a few meters, probably, given the turbidity of water here. In very clear water, it can go as deep as 10 or 20 meters. But this water is, as you know, more turbid, has more suspended sediment. So it's probably going to get into my guess would be able to get into somewhere in the 5 or 6 meter range.
Okay.
And
Sure.
also, of course, it's dependent on surf. If there's a lot of white water, the laser can't penetrate. So that's a system that's flown from a light aircraft or a medium aircraft, like a Twin Otter, and low and slow. It's eye safe, so there's no danger to folks on the ground. But it will produce a data set which spans the intertidal zone from, as I said, 5 or 6 meters deep, probably depending on conditions, up a certain distance up the beach. And I'm not sure how far up the beach that LiDAR is planned to go. But the goal is to produce a continuous profile of the shape of the coast in the area that was impacted by Merbach.
All right.
Get that rating?
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much, because we've gone way over, and I'm gonna, I guess we'll close it out if there's no more questions, because I'm blind. I can't see the room.
I don't see any other
This
questions.
is Cheryl from Native
Ah.
Village of Gamble. I'm been listening and very interesting, and I'm just blown away
Thank you,
with all
Cheryl.
the
Good to hear you.
surveying going on. Yes, thank you, everybody, for all that you do for us out here.
Very good. And
Thank you for
I know
that.
it's impressive. These guys are going to give us some good charts and maps that we'll be able to use, and that the other ships will be able to keep safe with as well.
Yes.
So we like that. So thank you very much. And thank you for your patience in calling in. Sitting through that.
Yes.
No chart, no presentation in front of you. All right. So with that, next week's Straight Science is on the 25th. We're going to have Sarah Fowle, and she's going to be talking about a coring project, sort of a long-term look at the Bering Strait region, looking at cores of sediment. And she will be on Sikuliaq this year. And so this is going to be a very interesting, there'll be multiple speakers talking about her, sort of her look back in time over across the Bering Strait region, some of our history on a big time scale. So it should be really interesting. And also we will be seeing Sikuliaq in the Bering Strait region this summer as well. So stay tuned for that, and we'll put out information on that here pretty soon. And I want to again thank Admiral Evans for coming to the Bering Strait region for all kinds of reasons, but giving us a shout out tonight and spending a little bit of time with Straight Science. And we look forward to communicating with Lieutenant Wilkinson as she comes on board as Alaska's navigation manager, and taking the helm over from Hadley Owen, who's done a magnificent job. So with that, I think we'll shut her down and say good night. And if you guys, Amy, if you guys can stick around for a little bit, I'll shut her down now, and we'll check in with you. So thank you all for coming, and have a good night, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.